Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I'm here because I've read the Transitions report from 2011, and I've read the sequel to that report, the Building a Rehabilitation Culture report. And I'm convinced that not only is the RSA writing some of the most interesting things about rehabilitation anywhere, but they're also doing it. And criminology is both theory and action, and that knowing and also doing and then learning some more is precisely how criminology is done. And I think too often we think of rehabilitation as this kind of reversal of everything that's going to come in this kind of magic bullet. And over again, we're disappointed when we find out that magic bullet doesn't actually give us the results that we're looking for. And what we're seeing is, of course, no single factor is going to undermine an overarching culture, the kind of overarching climate and institutional effects that you see so strongly in Alison Liebling's great research at the University of Cambridge, and I'm glad to see Alison here today. That it's not a matter of introducing a single program or a single project. We need to change the entire barrel. The entire culture needs to change if we want to see the kind of changes we should see. Crime, as we know, is nothing if not a social phenomenon. And there's kind of no more key Enlightenment understanding than that. This is from Wilkinson's great book, The Spirit Level, simply showing the strong correlation between unequal societies and high incarceration rates. The more unequal the society, the higher the incarceration rate. And this is something we've known for a long time. This is straight out of Enlightenment thinking, so Rousseau, Voltaire, and the like. The key insight that has yet to be incorporated, I think, into our criminal justice thinking in a substantial way. But that is, if crime is a social phenomenon, then surely our response to crime, and rehabilitation being our primary response, needs to also be a social response. The Enlightenment, in many ways, never came to criminal justice. Like the RSA, the field of criminology was born in the Enlightenment, and it also is inherently an Enlightenment exercise, an enterprise. Yet we work in a sort of surreal parallel universe where the work that we do largely has no impact on the broader workings of the criminal justice system. Now, of course, this isn't to say the Enlightenment didn't impact criminal justice. We had, of course, Beccaria, and in many ways he's been called the father of criminology, the father of penology. And one could ask, well, didn't his classic of Crimes and Punishment in 1764 essentially do away with the barbarian forms of justice from the Middle Ages and herald a new enlightened criminal justice system? But there's little evidence that that's actually true. There's no question that Beccaria was enormously influential. It was a hugely influential book at the time that he wrote it, and that influence has never really died since then. But we've essentially been living with Beccaria's justice system since 1764 in many ways. Yet Beccaria was a deeply conservative figure who sought to create a criminological system which evaded the difficult questions, the revolutionary questions that were inherent in Enlightenment thought. So essentially, his legacy to the field of criminology, but more importantly to criminal justice systems around the world, was to create the massive bureaucracy that we currently have. Essentially, despite his reputation as a great reformer, Beccaria basically developed a modest, derivative, status quo preserving carve-up of Enlightenment justice that basically preserved the sovereign's right to punish excessively through a vacillation between utilitarian deterrence theory and a bit of non-limiting retributivism thrown in. Yes, he was successful in reforming the practice of torture, although not corporal punishment, which he advocated in the book. He did have an impact on the death penalty and judicial discretion, but he was very much in favor of the use of punishment and imprisonment in particular, and instead put the power of a punishment into the hands of the state in such a way that nearly guaranteed that punishments would increase, not decrease, in the name of the common good. So this is the challenge. The justice system we have today is still largely the same as it's been for 200 years. We're caught in a kind of Beckerian cycle, I would argue. This isn't to say, and the RSA is clear about this in their reports, that innovative, important rehabilitative work, forward-thinking, enlightenment thinking doesn't go on inside the walls of our prisons today. Of course it does. But the work is patchy, it's piecemeal, it's unsupported, it's fragile, and most importantly, it's often hidden from wider views, in many ways purposefully so. To do good work, to do rehabilitation work, we think it has to be done out of the sight of the community, of the wider public, and in particular, of course, the tabloid media, for fear that it will be displeasing to these masters, which is hugely ironic. And what's worse is it didn't have to be like this. During the Enlightenment, there were a number of other voices besides Beccaria's that were taking the same source material, Hume and Rousseau and Voltaire, Locke and the like, and making an entirely different argument about what justice should look like. So there is a chance, a moment, I think, an opportunity for a new Enlightenment thinking around justice, an alternative Enlightenment, maybe a true Enlightenment vision of what justice could and should be. But then again, we have to be careful about this thinking. As a criminologist who studies rehabilitation, I admit to finding myself awfully excited and somewhat confused by the announcement 3 or 4 years ago now of Ken Clark's rehabilitation revolution. And now, of course, we're in a moment of transforming rehabilitation. Rehabilitation as a concept, and every criminologist was taught this, was officially deemed dead as recently as the 1970s. In criminology, we're taught this story that rehabilitation was killed by a study done by a researcher named Martinson, and his colleagues in the 1970s were asked to review all of the available evidence on rehabilitation research, and in doing so, they came to the conclusion that we know very little about what works, which came to be known as the conclusion that nothing works in rehabilitation. And this became a very important and landmark sort of study. To many, Martinson became a kind of hate figure, and many of us spent a number of decades trying to disprove this notion that nothing works, and created the What Works movement, which eventually changed from the question mark to the exclamation point when we decided that we know what works in reforming offenders. But by the 1980s, we were getting books with titles like The Decline of the Rehabilitative Ideal, and one of my favorite quotes from the great criminologist Richard Korn: "No one but an academic simpleton would even use the word rehabilitation without apprehension." Well, look what's back. The idea of rehabilitation is back, not just back, but back in the form of a revolution. So what's going on here? Why won't rehabilitative ideal just bloody die already? Well, there's one argument that came from criminology itself. There was an article here that came out in the Journal of Criminology, and it was written by the then president of the American Society of Criminology, who he delivered this as the annual presidential address to the field, and the title was "The 12 People Who Saved Rehabilitation: How the Science of Criminology Made a Difference." And in that article, he makes the case that everybody believed that nothing works, but that had been changed in recent years, and that the change was down to a small group of 12 criminologists who rejected the nothing works professional ideology and instead used rigorous science to show that offenders were not beyond redemption, that treatment programs rooted in criminology could work, and were able, therefore, to reduce recidivism through this process. Now, everything that Cullen says in this argument is absolutely correct in the sense that Criminologists were doing outstanding research on rehabilitation, and there was this change in public acceptability of rehabilitation as a concept. What he doesn't make the case for is that this is a causal relationship, and that this research was the final push to change this rehabilitative shift. And I would argue that much like Martinson in the original, that this is probably more a case of correlation rather than causation. I don't think that either Ken Clark or the governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger at the time, were reading the research of these 12 criminologists when they decided to bring back rehabilitation into the rhetoric of the popular discourse of their day. So we suffer this Enlightenment fairy story, as David Garland calls it, something of a white horse problem in criminology. This excitement that comes where there's sporadically a new project, a new program that gets marched out. This is what I call the magic bullet phenomenon, where individuals get very excited about certain bits of research and believe that this is going to lead the way to change, and inevitably, when we see that it doesn't, there's a backlash against this, and we become cynical, and we fall into cycles of nothing works as well in this. And there's something intoxicating about this question of what works, this sense of holding the keys to something that's so distressful and stressing to the wider community. To have the answer to the crime problem is a very tempting one, and it's one that's easy to fall into. And I think that's a real problem of Enlightenment criminology. It's also a problem for the media and the criminal justice system more widely. And I think what we're seeing here is a response to this kind of criminological hubris that leads itself into these inevitable cycles of disappointment and cynicism. Again, to go back to Newman on Beccaria, he blames Beccaria as the original reformer on this history that we have of these sort of fleeting success followed by abysmal failure, both personal and institutional. I had a very personal and interesting response to this in a blog that I do on criminological thinking. I got a remarkable response from Robert Martinson's son. I was saying we need to abandon this notion of what works because it inevitably leads to these cycles that I was talking about. He says the word work certainly means something, and what that is not hard to discover. Simply, what will have a reliable result? What government expenditure Y will produce result Z? What set of inputs will produce a consistent set of outputs? So this is the kind of the holy grail we're looking for with the what works question and Enlightenment criminology. He said, explicating this question this way teases at the larger problem inherent in the enterprise of what works, which is that impersonal forces and persons remain definitionally different. The sociology essentially is not physics, or at least it's not Newtonian physics, to predict the discrete behavior of objects under stress, because the human is a subject which only violence can reduce to an object. I hope you're still following. This is all a response to a blog. What a smart gentleman. He says, to Martinson's surprise, his father's surprise, his generation decided that violence, mass incarceration, was the only reliable tool to get Newtonian results in a world of stubbornly quantum human individuality. They solved the non-scientific problem of human choice and freedom by refusing individuals both en masse. They answered his question of what works definitively, at least for his generation, but the question was not meaningless, it was loaded. So Martinson's setting us on the trail to find this magic bullet of what works essentially found it with mass incarceration. It was the only perfect expenditure Y that will produce result Z. The only way to get those kind of Newtonian results consistently and across all contexts is incapacitation and locking people away for long periods of time. But the incarceration solution feeds itself a wider cultural change. This correlation that we see between inequality and incarceration is supposed to show the damaging effects of inequality on incarceration, but it could also show the other way around, that mass incarceration can lead to greater inequality in society, and it can do that in a number of ways, but we know that mass incarceration has increased inequality, it's increased poverty in society. It does this by impacting the children of prisoners in negative ways that are shown in Joe Murray's recent research. It also impacts on the communities that prisoners are drawn from in consistent and predictable ways, as Todd Clear shows in his book on imprisoning communities. It's reduced marriage rates, it's weakened labor markets, it's served as a source of negative attitudes toward the justice system more widely, according to Todd Clear's research. And of course, most importantly, it creates an underclass of individuals who are themselves socially stigmatized and excluded from the mainstream, who go through the prison service. So the culture that the incarceration creates feeds on itself. It creates its own inequalities and culture of punitiveness. And we see this in our own research. Hence, the excitement around the RSA's language of talking about creating entire cultures of rehabilitation. This is from the new report soon to be launched. Making further headway in rehabilitation, they say, is too important to leave to prisons, justice agencies, or top-down government approaches. They're quick to say this isn't to imply any criticism about these groups, nor to claim that we've got a magic bullet in the RSA. It's rather to say that a better response to reoffending is much more likely to emerge when the collective we is moved into action. That is, the magic bullet alone, or any individual group within a prison or a justice agency, isn't going to create rehabilitation. If rehabilitation is a social problem, if crime is a social problem, it needs a social solution, that collective we being moved into action. We see this in classrooms all the time. There's a great deal of research in the education area looking at the creation of hope within classrooms and optimism, that we see that we can manipulate teacher beliefs in students. And you see a self-fulfilling prophecy effect. When teachers believe in their students and what are called Pygmalion effects, students come to believe in themselves. And we've seen dozens of different studies confirm this idea both inside and outside of the classroom. We've seen it in nursing home studies. We've seen this in the workplace, in business schools, in courtroom studies, and numerous other examples of this. Steele and Aronson call this, one of these effects, a stereotype a threat, and have demonstrated how situational reminders of negative stereotypes about one's group can lead to lower performances on standardized tests and other outcomes, and the reverse as well, that higher expectations can consistently lead to higher outcomes. And it's this kind of climate, this kind of social rehabilitation process, and not a process of risk, not a process of suspicion or deficits, but a process where institutions and communities, most importantly, believe that people can change, and they support those change processes to happen within our institutions. So giving the last words here to the RSA report, again, they decided that rehabilitation is something that all of us want to see, but it eludes us. It is a social benefit that requires a social response. And they argue that the transitions offers one way of mobilizing this. And that, to me, struck a really important chord. I think the Enlightenment vision that I would like to see for justice is one based on this notion of shared guilt, shared responsibility for crime, and also shared responsibility for rehabilitation. This is from a 1971 article on redemption and politics, where Roger Smith argues that unlike punishment, which mobilizes our sense of virtue and sets us apart from the transgressor, forgiveness arouses in us and depends upon a sense of shared weakness, a humility that comes, that we are moved to forgive out of our own need to be forgiven for what we have done in the past and what we may do in the future. Forgiveness, unlike punishment, moreover, depends upon a life of common values and concerns. And I think that is precisely the Enlightenment vision that the RSA is trying to create with transitions.
If we're on a precipice, which sounds quite exciting, if scary, what can push us over? What kind of things can actually take us over the precipice?
Obviously, the economic situation has brought us here in lots of ways. Rehabilitation may come in times of plenty, and it may come in times of relative deprivation. And at this point, it's certainly the latter case. And I think the idea of the traditional justice system as a kind of bottomless pit of resources and money that can be thrown, that there's essentially no limit to how the public's appetite, and Ian Loader compares it to ice cream and the inability to stop with punitiveness. I think that kind of feeding of the justice machinery ended with the economic recession, collapse. And gave us this opportunity to change the way we think about justice. Whether it's going to, there's nothing about a crisis that leads us in this direction, and this would take sustained work. It would take the kind of grassroots work that organizations like those in this room and the RSA are better at. But I think it was a trigger for forward.